Every once in a while on this channel, we end up talking about something political or economic that's going to impact our investments. Today is one of those days because if you've been watching the news in Canada at all, you've seen a lot of talk about something that has been labeled as interprovincial trade barriers. In today's video, super quickly, I'm going to just discuss the topic. What exactly are these trade barriers? What does this mean? How does it impact you as a Canadian investor? And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific cases that may or might already have come up where these interprovincial trade barriers might come down and how that could be beneficial for Canadian companies. Welcome to Golden Larch Investing. My name is Liam. In today's video, we're going to have a pretty quick discussion about what exactly an interprovincial trade barrier is so that you can better understand why this impacts investors and why you should be following this news. If that kind of thing interests you, you're interested in Canadian investing at all, please do subscribe to the channel. It makes a huge difference to us and it doesn't cost anything. I've got some notes up on the screen beside me just so I stay on track. But essentially, the interprovincial trade barriers are sets of rules and regulations that differ between provinces. There are several jurisdictions in Canada where provinces hold the final say on things like the environment, on different safety regulations, on food regulations, and more. And so when you are a business trying to work in Canada and trying to expand beyond whatever province you started in, you run into these barriers that will impact your ability to do profitable business. This has been in the news a lot, and according to some of the sources that I've seen, they're arguing these barriers put a 2 to 20% impact on any sort of trade going across the province. One of the biggest things they're talking about here is particularly the different rules about trucking that impacts how things transport across the province, and labor, about how people can work and what certifications they need. But there are all sorts of different things as well. There's also restrictions on language, particularly in Quebec, that does obviously impact Anglophones that are only speaking the English language. So let's talk about a couple of these key barriers, because this is something that has now been in the news as a goal of both the federal and provincial governments to pull down. So we should talk about what exactly is going to be changed. So some of the key industries that really matter for this discussion are things that impact the environment or are things that impact food. And I think the big one that you are probably thinking of at the same time as me is going to be pipelines. We talk a lot about Canadian energy investing because we're a Canadian dividend-focused investing channel, and obviously the energy companies are greatly impacted by Canada's pipelines, or honestly, the lack of cross-Canada pipelines. Almost all of our energy resources are either in Alberta and British Columbia, and that sort of region in the Northern Prairie here, or offshore in the Atlantic. All of these products, in order to make it to market, need to be transported either to the market itself, so into the larger cities for things like natural gas, or down into the United States for things like crude oil, or transported out to the ocean where it can be shipped to the markets of the world. Now, obviously, the Pacific Ocean has been the main topic of conversation recently because from Alberta or northeastern British Columbia, it has the fewest interprovincial barriers. The East Coast has mainly stayed out of the conversation until now. And that's because just about, not quite 10 years ago, the discussion was that no way would East Coast shipping be allowed to transport any of their crude from pipelines from Alberta because of the different political reasons that places like Quebec particularly were blocking those interprovincial pipelines. Different environmental rules caused all sorts of problems. The federal government's solution caused even more problems for these companies, and so the East Coast was a no-go, and instead we ended up with TMX and not Northern Gateway. So big elephant in the room. That's been a big barrier. But there's all sorts of infrastructure projects that can't get built across provinces because of these same environmental rules. Let's keep going down the list. Let's look at a couple of other things in here. One of the interesting things that's happened recently, Tim Houston, Premier of Nova Scotia, has called for the Energy East pipeline. He's talked about how Alberta Oil and Gas can make it out to the Atlantic from his province or from New Brunswick, from the Maritime region. He's looking for that project to get resurrected. And they say that they could add billions of dollars to Canada's GDP. We've talked about Northern Gateway, how it's definitely a long road to resurrection there. And when I made that video just about a week ago, it seemed like the public was just turning. Well, according to Tim Houston and according to the government of Nova Scotia, obviously the public must have turned far more than I expected, because they are willing to step up and say they want this pipeline built. Very interesting. What's changed? Well, if you haven't been watching the news, then you wouldn't know. But the big major buy Canadian anti-American backlash in Canada is now causing the public sentiment to shift dramatically in favor of Canadian pipelines. So people like Tim Houston can now call for pipelines to be built across the country. So what does bringing down these trade barriers look like? This is really interesting because we've heard a lot from different federal ministers, from different provincial leaders, what this could look like. But essentially, it's not going to happen overnight. What's probably going to happen, in my opinion, is that enough political will be concentrated in a few key projects. A couple of the things I've seen, the Conservative Party of Canada has been talking about trucking regulations. I have seen discussions between provinces on food safety regulations. I have seen discussions between provinces on alcohol shipments and alcohol being allowed to be transported between provinces. I've seen conversation about pipelines. I think those sorts of key areas are the most likely to see maybe not immediate, but quick action. And Canadian companies that will now be able to more easily transport those products across the country will benefit. However, I don't know how long the political will to make these things will last. And so these kinds of larger projects, pipeline style projects, we're going to need to be very case by case if we're looking at investing in companies that are going to be impacted by these projects. I also think that probably the best option for an investor right now, if you're looking at all this news and you're wondering what should you do, is to continue to invest in Canadian companies. The absolute shift in the political will of this country has been dramatic. And I think it will impact our investments significantly. And I think it will be for the better. I think you're going to see more aggressive expansion of Canadian companies across the country. I think you're going to see more push for these companies to diversify their revenue streams, to partner with other countries around the world. And I think you're probably going to see a more stable, growing stock price because of it. When you eliminate the geopolitical risk that has sort of made it difficult to invest in Canada, that we talk about often here on the channel, and you take that away, and instead you push these companies to be more integrated into different economies around the world, you're going to see gains. I also think that if the various provincial or federal governments just back one or two key infrastructure projects, and specifically I'm talking pipelines, it could be an absolute momentum shift for the industry. This has been something I've talked about several times on here. I think it really matters, and I think it might be happening, if not now, soon. And that's about all I have for you folks today. If you enjoyed this video, you like talking about Canadian investing, you want to talk more about all of these various interprovincial trade barriers, about the different economic things happening in Canada, and of course about the companies that you as a Canadian investor can pick to be along for the ride, please do subscribe to the channel, like the video. It makes a huge difference and doesn't cost anything. And with that being said, I hope I see you in the next video.